I do get questions once in a while along the lines of, how can you possibly talk about this topic, this particularly sensitive issue, particularly personal issue, when you know that your own daughter will watch the videos one day, or she may. She may choose to watch the video, and she may choose not to. And given the title of this video, she can choose to watch it or choose not to. And, I actually feel positively about leaving these videos as a legacy for my daughter. For one thing, life is long, except when it gets tragically cut short. I never know if my next, airplane is going to crash, or, bus hits me crossing the road, whatever it may be. And then this video is the only opportunity my daughter ever has to hear that side of my life, hear that side of my story. And, beyond that, I actually think you're forgetting how much easier it is for someone to watch a YouTube video than to talk about these things face-to-face with their own parents. I can remember how awkward and frankly awful it was talking about sexuality with my parents when the time came. It was horrible. It was absolutely awful. It reflects a lot of bad things about my parents' character and about my parents' political view of the world. So actually I can imagine it would be a relatively easy thing for my daughter to watch a video like this, and then if she wants to talk about it with me, to be able to raise the subject with me, having already seen this, as opposed to having a lot of awkward pauses and silences. I can remember, looking down at the dinner table and not even wanting to make eye contact with my parents talking about this stuff. That would have been like age 11, age 12, when sex ed, sexual education, starts becoming a big issue in school. And, when your parents start talking about that side of human nature and that side of their own lives and experience. So it can be hard to hear. It can be hard to listen to. And if anything, the artificial distance created by the YouTube video, this may make it easier for my daughter to hear as much or as little as she wants to hear about this side of my life. Now, on the other hand, it's also interesting. This is like a genre, the video How I Lost My Virginity. And it's kind of weird that almost all the videos are from the perspective of like 18-year-old to 21-year-old people. Of course, I can think of a lot of reasons why older people do not want to share that side of their lives, or they want to keep it private. But within the genres of videos I watch, all the videos I watch are pretty much linked to my political interests, either to veganism or to something going on in politics, economics, what have you. Like lately, I've been watching videos about the civil war in Yemen. Current political events that are important to me. So if there are middle-aged people talking about this stuff, I don't see it. And it's when you're middle-aged that you have a lot more of a meaningful perspective looking back on it. But hey, both are great. Obviously, the perspective you have at the time it happened is going to be different from the perspective you have years later looking back and seeing that context. That is definitely true for myself. I mean, there's nothing traumatic about it, but my experience of how I lost my virginity is really, really negative. And it's interesting because I just a couple months ago, I had some email back and forth with the woman I lost my virginity with. So, we were the same age at the time, so we're the same age now, and her view of it is totally different from mine. She has a very romanticized, very positive, for her it's a wonderful, happy memory of how she met me, how she fell in love with me, what have you. And for me, it's really like a dark shadow, a dark cloud that hung over my life for years and influenced me in a really, really negative way. It was awful. It was awful in its short-term and long-term implications, and in terms of why I chose her rather than other women who were around and so on. For me, there are a lot of meaningful aspects to it, lessons to be learned from it. But they're not at all the same lessons that the young woman took from it. And by the way, she was not a virgin. So I lost my virginity with a girl who'd already been active sexually for several years. So different aspects to the story. Look, a digression that for me is not a digression. I just want to say, I do think that after a certain age, as a parent, you have to somehow give your child some space to make their own mistakes and take their own risks in life. With my ex-wife, I can remember saying to her, microphone's rolling off here. I can remember saying to my ex-wife, look, after a certain age, what's ideal is to give your kid a slightly separate apartment, not their own kitchen, not all the responsibilities of life and taking care of themselves. But if, for example, you have a house with a driveway, can you renovate the garage to really be a separate little apartment? Again, it doesn't have to have a kitchen, but where your kid at least has a truly separate bedroom that's separate from your four walls, where they can talk on the phone and listen to music without disturbing you, and where they can have friends over and where they can lose their virginity without having to go to a hotel, and where you're not policing every interaction they have with other young people their own age. I mean, I think if you're going to have a 16-year-old at home with you, if your kid is not going to move out of the house and become independent while they're still in high school, at a time when independence is an illusion anyway, can you take some steps to afford them the illusion of independence? A renovated garage, or, in Canada, you can buy a secondhand mobile home, an RV, a trailer that people can sleep in. You can buy a mobile home, put it in your driveway, And again, if you don't actually drive it around and it doesn't have a kitchen and gas hooked up, that's really just like a bedroom. But it is separate, and your kid then has some ability to, spend time alone or spend time with friends and boyfriends and make their own mistakes while you're close enough that they can get your help anytime they want to. They can still be coming into your kitchen and eating meals with you, 2 or 3 meals a day, and cooking and cleaning with you, but where they also do, to some extent, have a little bit of a separate home. That's really, I think, what's ideal when you've got kids who are 16 years old. And, I mean, do you have the money to do it? Different priorities in life. I could imagine that if I was living in an apartment building, making the decision to move at one point when my kid reached a certain age, instead of being in one big apartment, which is suitable for young children, to move to having 2 small apartments. If they're on the same floor in the same apartment building, or different floors in the same apartment building, where your kid has a separate apartment. And again, they're still coming to eat meals with you. You're still seeing them as much as is comfortable for all parties, but where they do have their own space to make some of their own mistakes while still being close enough to you so that you can bail them out when they make those mistakes, so they can literally come to you crying, which happens. Young people fall in love and fall out of love, and even people who remain virgins until marriage, the emotional component of sexuality can still be really, really livid. Is livid the word I want? I don't know. Vivid. Let's stick with vivid. All right. Anyway, look. The reality is that my first girlfriend, the girlfriend I lost my virginity with, I chose her for political reasons that completely reflect the cultural program I had up to that time, the culture of my own family, the culture in downtown Toronto at that time. I did not choose her because I was attracted to her, or because of chemistry between us, or because we were compatible in other ways. I didn't choose her as someone sexually compatible with me. I chose her as someone politically compatible with me. And in the vast majority of cases, that's going to lead to a lousy love life. And all kinds of people make that decision. I mean, as middle-aged people, I think it's a lot more common to make that decision when you're settled down and middle-aged instead of when you're a hot-blooded teenager. But I was a hot-blooded teenager who had options. I had a lot of beautiful women throwing themselves at me before, after, and during that relationship with my first girlfriend. And I was turning those down because I really received the message that my role in life was to be a left-wing intellectual. I'm not left-wing anymore. I grew out of it. But I was absolutely taught, I was absolutely inculcated with these far left-wing values. And I was inculcated with the value that anyone I love, anyone I have sex with, anyone I'm in a relationship with, must be my intellectual equal and must be basically reading and caring about left-wing politics on that same level. So my first girlfriend was a young woman who had read Karl Marx. She had read Che Guevara. She cared about far left-wing issues. She cared about, Nicaragua. Not so much Vietnam in her case, but, she had a list of, left-wing civil wars and revolutions that she had read the history of and cared about. And so she really checked those boxes, those check marks, that I can't even say those were things that my parents explicitly taught me to look for. But in the same way that a lot of people who grow up Jewish only want to be with someone who's Jewish, in the same way you grow up in an extreme left-wing family. Because my parents were not moderate. They were left-wing extremists. And you only want to be with someone else who's a left-wing extremist. I am very, very glad I did not get trapped in a relationship like that long term, because I grew out of it. I'm not left wing at all anymore, as a lot of you will know from this channel. I think my views are very moderate and centrist, but many vegans now perceive me as conservative because I'm not way out in the left wing, and most people in veganism are. So now again, I don't think she remembers it that way. what she remembers, the girl I lost my virginity with, what she remembers is meeting me at this party, and from the moment she laid eyes off me, she was swept off her feet. And it was the sort of classic teenage courtship scenario. We're at this party, and she saw me dancing. I was dancing with another girl, and she was standing there with her circle, like a semicircle of like 4 or 5 friends on either side of her. And, she had her mouth open. Her jaw was dropped. She was 100% into me. And all her friends were standing next to her, like holding her arm, be like, go talk to him. Egging her on, encouraging her to be confident and go over and initiate with me. Now, look, again, I have to emphasize at this time, so I was 16, I had options. I had a lot of objectively good-looking women who were really at me and really offering to lose their virginity with me. Women who were virgins and who were very, very good-looking at that age. Again, I say objectively good-looking. Some people, there's beauty is in the eye of the beholder. There's the person you fall in love with. There's the person you feel or perceive to be beautiful. There's also just your taste. You have your own idiosyncratic view of these things. But one of the girls coming at me then, she later became like a TV presenter. Again, so that's not subjective beauty. She had the kind of beauty where you go to an audition and you get a talent agent and you get put on TV because you're so good looking. And when my father met that girl, the girl who became a TV presenter, he freaked out. He just said, she's unbelievable. How can you possibly turn that down? But I did turn her down. I did turn her down because she was not a left-wing intellectual. Culturally, she was very, very different from me. And I remember I met her mom for like 5 seconds. And, her whole family background was so alien to me at that age, I was not confident to get into bed with her or make those compromises. And I do regret it for that reason. Looking back on it, it's not like I regret it because she was beautiful. I regret it because it would have been really meaningful for me at that age to have a relationship with someone who was from a totally different cultural background, totally different political values too, of course. And instead, what I ended up doing was pursuing and getting with women who were very much from the same cultural background, the same political background, above all else. Anyway, another one of the women who came at me before, after, and during that relationship, a woman who was really, really trying to get into bed with me, she later became a stripper. She wasn't at that time, but maybe just 1 year later. Because I think she was 1 year older than me. So then I guess she turned 18 and became a stripper. So again, she was really objectively good looking. I have a lot of funny stories about her. Again, I turned her down. And that for me, those were not the criteria. For me, on a deep level, it was inculcated into me, I had to be with someone who was my intellectual equal, someone I could in that sense respect and who respected me and who shared these political values that were absolutely like the backbone of my upbringing. So I met this girl at this party. Her memory of it is very, very different from mine. I don't think she fell in love with me. For her, it was love at first sight. And for me, it wasn't. For me, I met her, and it was really later, it was when I found out about her political background. Okay, you've read Karl Marx. You know what I mean? That was like, okay, so this clicks. This is the girl for me to do this with. But she thinks of the story as starting. She thinks of chapter 1 of that story as being she laid eyes on me. I was dancing with another girl. I wasn't alone at the party. And she falls in love with me, and then she does her best. She basically put me in a headlock. She just absolutely did everything in her power to get into bed with me as soon as possible. And again, she was not a virgin. She just knew what she wanted, and she did whatever it took. And, again, from her perspective, she was swept off her feet by me. But that's not even the way I see that. It's not like I pursued her. You know what I mean? Anyway, it's great. So to some extent, the sweeping off the feet was mutual. But for me, that's all chapter 2, because before she got interested, there was another girl at that party I was already interested in and talking to. Obviously for only a few minutes or something, before she came in with her circle of friends and, tried to kind of take over and shut things down. And again, my whole life would be different in some subtle way if I had instead gotten with that girl or what have you. But I did not choose her because of a sense of natural, attraction. And that really foretold the fact that my experience of losing my virginity and of all human sexuality with that girlfriend and for years afterwards was really, really negative. Now, I mean, so partly there's this kind of romantic and even biological aspect of it. Like, how are you selecting your partner? If you select someone mostly because of their money, then it's unlikely you're going to have great sex with the person. It's possible. You roll the dice. You could choose someone because they're rich, and it turns out you're really compatible and you have a great love life, and it goes great, and I'm happy for you. If you choose someone, but by the same token, if you choose someone for those political reasons, it's really something artificial. And if you're a virgin, if it's your first serious relationship, you don't have anything to compare it to, right? So you're choosing someone for those reasons that, again, culturally I perceived as very moral and upstanding and good to choose a woman for those reasons. And to have a woman I could show to my parents and say, hey, look, this girl has read Karl Marx. You know, it's really like finding someone who's the same religion as you are with extreme left-wing politics. Absolutely, it's a religion. Absolutely it is. It was my family faith that I later had to rebel against. It's just very, very unlikely you're going to connect sexually and be compatible that way. You know, there are other things about her that were idiosyncratic because she was experienced. She wasn't a virgin, but her approach to sexuality did not work for me at all. It was terrible. And, I mean, there are technical aspects to it as well. I had years and years of sex education, and then the main focus was use a condom, don't get AIDS, use a condom, use a condom. And it seems like they told you everything about condoms except the fact that implicitly they come in sizes, right? Like in a male wardrobe, the only items that don't come in sizes are neckties and belts. But a condom is not a necktie and it's not a belt. And if the condom is too small for you, although it is physically possible to have sex, it's absolutely horrible. If a condom is just slightly too small, yes, it's possible to have sex, but it's awful. And again, the condoms in the Western world, they don't come in size. It's not like picking out shoes where you just have size 10, 11, 12, and you can go and figure it out or something. Instead, and condoms were expensive. I mean, I didn't have much money back then, but, you know, relative to how much money you got and everything else, like you're looking at these condoms, they just all come in these over-the-top boxes. And some of them have, like in giant gold lettering, extra, extra large. But in some cases, that's just like false advertising. It's just a way to appeal to the male ego. Like they want to sell more condoms by pretending it's really large, but the difference in size is minuscule. It's a tiny percentage. And in some cases, they really are, you know, extra, extra large. So I was in an awful position that way. And I didn't figure that out for years afterwards. I mean, so the whole time I was with my first girlfriend, the sex was awful. Partly for the more abstract reasons of who she was and who I was and why I chose her. Partly due to my own inexperience, of course. Of course it would be better if your experience was fundamental. But the condom thing was fundamental. So I mean, the actual sensation of having sex was awful for the whole relationship. And because the condom I was using a regular size condom, which is for me like 6 sizes too small. And that can induce like horrible, you know, I mean, like it can cause erectile dysfunction because it's choking your cock, if you pardon my English. I mean, it's awful. It's absolutely horrible. And again, looking at you have this kind of egalitarian myth that all condoms are the same size. Still today, if you look on the internet, you'll see people saying, oh no, anyone can use a condom the same size. It's not true. It's absolutely not true. And looking at the condoms, just standing there as a kid, as a 16-year-old kid, looking at the selection of brands, the differences between them seem to be everything except size. You know, one is bright red and one is bright blue and one offers this feature and one offers that feature. But size, it's almost this secret. You know what I mean? It's like this implicit thing that's not explained to you and wasn't explained in my sex education, what have you. So that was, I mean, it was awful. And again, it wasn't a one-night stand. It was a relationship that went on for several months. I mean, it seemed like a long time back then. And again, there's a mismatch here. My whole experience of sexuality at that stage of my life, on the one hand, there were positive aspects of it that a lot of other men never felt. I had the experience of women who were really beautiful pursuing me and really offering themselves to me, propositioning themselves to me, which, again, some men don't experience that at 16, some men don't experience it ever. I had the experience of that with girls my age being really into me. And I also had the experience with adult women, older women, whatever, 25 plus 30-year-old women trying to have sex and trying to initiate sex with me when I was that age, when I was 16. So I mean, that's kind of positive, if you're a young man with a high sex drive, where you feel valued and you see that going on. And out of all these options I had, I made this choice for the reasons that I did, and so on. So I mean, that's very positive. But the contrast to that was that the sex itself was absolutely awful. And this really shaped my philosophical worldview in a profound way. And that continued for years, that perception. I mean, the next girlfriend I had after that also is pretty awful too, the sex and so on. And it took me years to figure out the thing with the condoms and everything else. So, I mean, I'm asking myself, sex was a very small part of my life back then. It was a very low priority, and it still is. It's a small part of my life. It's a low priority. Okay, I'm lying. Okay, right now, it's an enormous part of my life. But anyway, and it's a really high priority. So that's changed. That's changed. At age 38, sex is a much, much larger part of my life now than it was during high school or university. Exponentially larger. And it's more hours of the day, too. It's so... Okay, so that was I misspoke. I misstepped there. But no, so now it's a huge part of my life. But it wasn't back then. And for many years it wasn't. It was a low priority. But I was asking myself, what is the meaning of life? What is my place in this world? As a lot of young people do at that age. And I was finding the answers in bits and pieces of ancient Greek philosophy, ancient Roman philosophy, bits and pieces of 19th century German philosophy. I then got into philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, and eventually Buddhist philosophy that has this very, very negative view of human sexuality. Has this view that, desire is almost infinite, and then the gratification offered by sex and romantic love is finite and is so tiny as to be something despicable, something that a man of substance ought not to care about, not to take seriously. That a man ought to know that, you carry this burden of desire. It's like walking around with a heavy rock on your back. And then when you put the rock down, you feel some relief, you feel some satisfaction. But it's a total delusion to think that that is pleasure. So those ideas, again, you can find them in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. You find them in some modern philosophers like Schopenhauer, and you find it in Buddhist philosophy. But I was only seeking out and reading that stuff and responding to that stuff because of my own empirical experience with sex being awful. It really did shape the way I viewed the world and the way I developed intellectually, morally, and otherwise. And I should say also, you have this contrast between kind of the life of desire, the biological urges, and the life of the mind. And then you also have the contrast between what my experience with sex is, with just one woman, to leave it at that. I had other girlfriends afterwards, but that first relationship, that it's such a big influence on me. And the ridiculous glorification of sex in the mainstream media, in music, in movies. So again, those things, they really reinforced each other. And I have to say, losing my virginity in the way that I did, and that relationship going the way it did, and even on the level of physical sensation, my experience of how sex went, was a tremendously negative influence in my life for many, many years. I also got to see that, even though I chose a girl who my parents would be proud of, a girl who read Karl Marx, a girl my parents approved of, and everything else, the relationship showed me more than ever before what complete hypocrites my parents were and how they didn't live up to the promises they made. Because they did talk through with me. They made very specific promises about what their view of sexuality was, that I wasn't growing up in a Christian home, that I wasn't expected to be a virgin until marriage. And they would they promised they would be supportive and positive about my having a girlfriend, that I wouldn't have to sneak around and have sex in secret. You know what I mean? This is something I could be open and honest about. And I got to see the moment I did have a girlfriend, what complete hypocrites they were, how totally incapable they were of living up to their own hype. And I was one of many cracks in the facade of their left-wing ideology that was inculcated into me. And it's definitely true. Remember, that first girlfriend, we did have many meaningful conversations about politics and, the future of planet Earth and what have you. But I guess she was my first left-wing girlfriend, but she was also my last left-wing girlfriend. Because very soon after that, even though, as I say, in some ways that put me on a road toward Buddhist philosophy, or reinforced that monastic tendency in my character that had always been there to some extent. I guess you can also say it was part of my realizing the hollowness of so much of the left-wing political worldview and heading off in a more meaningful direction where, I didn't want to just talk about poverty or use poverty as an excuse for revolution. I wanted to actually do something about poverty. I didn't want to just be part of a cult that made a kind of cynical use of the science of economics to back up its political agenda. I wanted to actually understand economics, understand how the world works, how I can make a positive difference, not just use the problems of the world as a pretext for revolution or anti-American sentiments or what have you. And even with something like the Vietnam War, I didn't want to just have this shallow, holier-than-thou sense of what happened in Vietnam and why it proves that the American empire is so terrible. I wanted to know what really happened and why, and see it from all perspectives. And again, that set me on a path to eventually actually living in Laos and Cambodia and doing a lot of research and reading and having a deeper and more meaningful engagement with all of these issues, political and otherwise. So look, Karl Popper is a philosopher who's very important to me personally. Karl Popper, if you haven't heard of him, he does philosophy of science. He also does criticism of communism and left-wing politics. He's long dead, but he's a modern philosopher, Karl Popper. Karl Popper talks about the extent to which empirical experience, although we rely on it for everything, in science and in politics, empirical experience can bias us, can prejudice us in such a powerful way. And that's really the final thing I have to say in this video, is that the tragedy of human sexuality is you think you know it and you think you know yourself, but actually you're working from such a small selection of empirical experiences. And you don't know until you try and you fail 5 times, 10 times, whatever it takes. And for me, the long-term shadow that losing my virginity left over my life was exactly that everything about the sex itself in that relationship was so negative, was so awful. And I didn't know what good sex was. I didn't know what sex could be. And that led me to a view of human biology as something that's set up for perpetual disappointment, perpetual sorrow, for love being something that's really kind of a sick joke that nature, a prank that nature pulls on us just to trick us into getting somebody pregnant, and that, love can only lead to sorrow, and that, desire is this fire that can never be doused by the, paltry satisfaction offered by sex itself. And believe me, it never entered my mind at that age that I was basically being misled by my own empirical experience, and that fundamentally I was just in bed with the wrong woman and using the wrong condom. And that there was still a lot more for me to learn, even if that was in this category of experiences that's outside of anything that you see in the mainstream media, in the songs and the movies and the poetry and even the philosophy that spends so much time talking about sex. And yet sex is something you can never really understand any way other than getting out, doing it yourself, getting your heart broken, get up, feel the heartbreak, live through it, get your heart broken again. Learn how to have an open heart and an open mind, even if you carry some bitterness with you, even if you have some disappointment, down in your back pocket. Learn to live with it. Learn to thrive on it. Learn how to learn. That's the hardest part of all. That's what your parents can't teach you. And that's why ideally, if you're a parent at some point, you got to give that teenager their own space, their own opportunities to make their own mistakes.